I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor.
Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm naturopathic doctor in Ontario supporting women with women's health concerns. Today, we're talking about a totally different aspect of health than we've chatted about on the podcast recently. I've invited my very good friend, Dr. Shyamala Kiru, to the podcast. Shyamala, welcome.
Jordan, thank you so much for having me. I think this is my second time.
This is your second time. And
this is my second time.
You, my friend, have accomplished a lot since we talked last.
There's been a lot going on. There's been a lot going on, I think, globally. I'm trying to think the last time we talked would have probably been in the last 2 years. I think maybe it's been a year.
It was at the very beginning of the pandemic.
I thought
the
so.
Very beginning of the pandemic, like spring 2020 is when we talked last.
Yeah. So I think you and I were talking, a lot has shifted for each of us clinically and work-wise and family-wise, all of those sorts of things. But a lot of really exciting opportunities as well.
Yeah. And when I think about our, I'm going to say our businesswoman friendship, Shyamala, because we got connected through from a business perspective first. We're both in the same sort of mastermind. Then we became friends. And now we've got this, that very confident and secure relationship where we could not talk for 8 months and yet, things are great. Right. And it actually lends into this conversation that we're about to have about your book, and the topic is, sort of the emotionally intelligent woman. And it made me think of that, for you and I, we could literally not talk for 6 months and then pick right back up. But also I'm never sitting at home wondering if you don't like me anymore.
It's so funny because I feel like that's exactly what happened recently, right? I think your team reached out to my team and said, do we want to podcast again? And that was several months ago. And then we connected recently, just Instagram DMs or whatnot. And it was I really miss you and I'm really proud of you. I really miss you and I'm really proud of you too. And I think you're absolutely right. It's something I think about the evolution of who we are as women, which is I'm sure what we're going to be talking about today with the emotionally intelligent woman. And when we really choose to invest in ourselves, invest in a set of skills, right, that I call emotional intelligence, and how that really does lend to the way we show up in all parts of our life, including our friendships.
And part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation, one, to highlight my friend's book. I'm going to take every opportunity to showcase the work or the amazing work that the women in my life are doing, but also just how important and valuable this information is. So often when I think about the women that I work with, or even my listeners, right, they're really kind of stuck in some of those that day-to-day mundane, mindless living. I'm going to call it out, right? That we're driving our kids everywhere. We're kind of ignoring a lot of our health symptoms. And as a consequence, we're also engaging in a lot of communication patterns that are safe and sometimes completely dysfunctional. And usually when I'm working with women, I need them to take a step back from that, right? And say this mundane practice isn't working. This automatic drive-through breakfast isn't working, right? This staying up late and scrolling on your phone isn't working. And quite often, at the root of a lot of this is the way that they feel about themselves, and the way they show up in their relationships also becomes this massive barrier to them putting themselves first. And so what I want to talk about is what is the emotionally intelligent woman? What does that even mean? And why this is something that women need to invest in, because we need to pull ourselves up and out of that, mindless moving through our day, so that women can actually reach their full potential.
Yeah, I love that you're contrasting the concept of mindless living and sort of taking that step back, taking that scope back, pulling ourselves out of the day to day, the sort of routine, the pattern, because I think that is exactly what's required to become what I call the emotionally intelligent woman. So maybe I can just very briefly sort of give your listeners like an overview of what I would consider to be the characteristics of the emotionally intelligent woman. So first and foremost, I think we know that the field of emotional intelligence has existed for a long time. It's not something that I made up, right? There's lots of research, lots of evidence around what makes up emotional intelligence. The concepts around emotional intelligence are heavily used in the leadership and business space. They're heavily taught in those areas. And I would say they really came to the forefront of research. They really came to the forefront of corporate culture. They started to come to the forefront, even I would say, in the education system. We started to see the importance of emotional intelligence, even in terms of parenting and in the education system, teaching, like with kids, all of that sort of thing. I would say probably in the last 1 to 2 decades, right? And I've been in practice. I practiced for almost 2 decades, and I call it retired from clinical practice. Still have my psychotherapy clinic, but I don't practice one-to-one anymore. But so this is something, Jordan, that has lots of evidence, lots of research, lots of science behind it, so many case studies. And I know that's your jam, right? Like I know your jam is like evidence-based work and evidence-based information. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love about emotional intelligence. So when we talk about a framework around emotional intelligence, I want your listeners to know that this is some information that you could really access in so many different places. What's probably going to be slightly different about our conversation is that what I became really interested in is the intersection between women's mental health, our emotional intelligence, and the way we navigate our relationships and our mission. So that's where I became really fascinated. Like that's where I really wanted to dive deep. And so when I talk about the emotionally intelligent woman, and when I developed the framework for what I call the emotional intelligence code, that's the framework that we use inside of our training labs that are specifically for women. We look at 4 pillars of success that allow women specifically, and I would say high powered women. So ambitious women that may be recovering type A's, perhaps they were achieveaholics, like I'm a recovering achieveaholic, right? Like women that are really used to being go, 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 right? How do we then slow down, pull back, as you've said, and really access some of these skills? And so the pillars of success, I'm not going to dive deep into any one of them because I really want you to lead the questions in the conversation, but I'll give you an overview. The pillars, the first pillar for me is emotional mastery. I really believe that every single woman deserves to have the ability to feel calm and confident, regardless of the external circumstances of her life. Doesn't matter what's going on, doesn't matter who's doing what, doesn't matter what's happening on a global scale. But I really believe, Jordan, that you and I and every single one of your listeners deserves and has the capacity to feel calm and confident, regardless of the shit that's going on in her life. And I think, this truth and this pillar became like that much more important to me in the last 2 years. Like, did I ever need to lean on those skills in the last 2 years? Like more than at any other point in my life, honestly. Right. So that for me is the first pillar of success.
Well, I'm excited about and now I want to know what the other pillars are. But why don't you tell us what they all are? Because then I want to come back to this, this last 2 years bit. But yeah, what are the others?
Yeah, let's briefly go over the others and then we can have a dialogue. And the second pillar for me is I call it fearless communication. These are just fancy little names I've given to it so that I'm able to train and coach my clients and my audience in terms of how to access this. Fearless communication is simply assertive communication skills, nuanced for women. And the reason I say nuance for women is because most of the women that I work with can show up really powerfully in certain aspects of their lives and then shrink when it comes to having difficult conversations. For some women, that's at home. For some women, that's at work. For some women, that's like with their in-laws, or, there's all sorts of different contexts where we can experience that dichotomy of I can feel really powerful, really articulate, really competent in certain aspects of my life. And then when it comes to having a difficult conversation or having a conversation where I'm afraid of the outcome, then I shrink. Right. So for me, fearless communication is the ability to enter into any conversation, any difficult conversation, regardless of that outcome, and not being tied to the outcome. The third pillar is what I call elevated relationships. It's simply the ability to set boundaries and negotiate your relationships without guilt, because guilt is the number one killer of like boundary setting and healthy relationships for women. I'm sure you can relate to that, because I certainly can. And the final pillar of success that I would say really has sort of come to fruition for me as I've grown and as I've evolved in my own practice is what I call leading with confidence. And this is for me the ability to make decisions without that self-doubt. And it was something, again, I think probably much like you, like as I've grown and as I've evolved as a practitioner and I've healed my own, patterns and injuries and, all the stuff that really held me back, I got greater and greater clarity on how to better serve the women I work with.
I feel like if we could tackle those things, like I feel like the world would be a different place, really, right? Like if women had those skills. And that's partly why I wanted us to, have this conversation. It's why I'm so excited about your book. And it's so reading your book, it's so accessible, right? Because it's very relatable. You're very vulnerable in the book too, about your own sort of personal experience with each of these areas, right? And how, because it makes you just feel like kind of seen and heard, that you kind of imagine, oh, this person is like a relationship expert, and yet, right, we all have these things that show up in our life from wherever they come from. And we all have this potential that they could be better, right? And I think that's one of the like main things I want to get across today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I think for me, when I think about my purpose, you and I have a really good friend who talks a lot about purpose, Dr. Megan Walker. And, her and I were at an event together yesterday, and she did a talk on purpose. And when I think about my purpose, Jordan, it's not simply to train women on these skills, but it's really for women to understand that it actually doesn't matter where you start, or it doesn't matter how deep those patterns go. And it really doesn't matter if today it feels like you don't have these skills. It's absolutely possible to learn them. Like they're just skills. It's not magic. It's not like woo woo. They're just a set of skills that if you have a framework around how to piece these skills together, sort of step by step, one at a time. And there is, in my opinion, a step-by-step method for really accessing and practicing emotional intelligence, right? Like I don't think any of these skills exist in a silo. I think they exist within a framework, and they should be practiced and learned within a framework. So I appreciate you saying that, because I certainly did. I almost came from the opposite background of what I teach, right? Like I was not taught assertive communication growing up. I was not taught that I could remain calm regardless of what was going on around me. I was taught to be reactive. I was raised to be reactive. That's what I saw.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you used that word practice, because I think too, when I watch women try something on, right? Like try on the hat of assertiveness, or try on boundary setting, and it doesn't go well that first time, or maybe it goes well the first time and then it doesn't go well the second time, that women often like sort of weave this story, and that these are traits in themselves for being passive and mowed over and apologetic and whatnot, versus them being just a learned pattern of behavior. So like, what do you notice when women like so that this practice, like I even think about myself, right? Like I can self-identify what some of my challenges are. I will, if I come at someone with assertive feedback and they're defensive and aggressive, I'll just apologize and like, I like your shrink. Or if I, give my opinion about something, or if I ask for support, and don't get that support. And then like, I can see those things in myself, right? But the goal is that we just keep showing up and trying anyways, because it is like getting good at a sport, really. Like, I think we should make those parallels, that you would never like swing at one baseball and then be like, oh, I guess I can't do this baseball thing.
I'm so glad you brought up the sport analogy, because I often do use it when I coach my clients. I think it's a perfect analogy. So when you think about how athletes train for a sport, right? So I always use the example of hockey. We're Canadian. I've never played hockey a day in my life, but I use the example. So if you think about a hockey player, right? And the skills that a hockey player needs in order to really amplify his or her success in that sport. Okay. That hockey player would never practice those skills only in the moment when they need it for the big game. Never. That would be ridiculous. Like, what kind of coach would be like, you don't need to practice it on a day-to-day basis. Don't bother practicing when you're not under stress. Like, you know what I mean? Like, just wait until the big game and the pressure's on and you're highly activated and there's all these people watching you. Then you're going to practice the skills. Well, here's the thing. When it comes to skills around regulating our emotions, asking for what we need, setting a boundary, decision-making, which are essentially the pillars that I use for emotional intelligence, most women simply try these skills on in the heat of the moment at the big game. There's no drills ahead of time. There's no practice with like small conversations that aren't like super difficult, but a little uncomfortable, right? Like we just go for it in those big moments of high pressure. And guess what happens? It doesn't go well, right? And then that negative self-talk comes in. And then we're like, see, I shouldn't have said anything anyway. Nobody listens to me. Right? Like, see, look what happened. I said something and now, my partner and I are just got into a fight. Right? See, I just gave some feedback and now my team member hates me. Like, right? Like, it's just all these narratives.
Is that because, like, do we do that because we let shit boil up for so long, or like we let the pressure build for so long, and then we're going to blow it, like we're going to blow. And so we're like, you know what? I'm going to set a boundary. Or is it because we're not seeing the opportunity for practice in the day to day, right? We asked our partner to get clementines and they didn't, and we don't bring it up. Mm-hmm. And so instead we wait until, they renegotiated our mortgage with the bank without us and go, you never listen to what I say.
Right. Where we could have addressed the clementines.
Right. Like if we had said, like, I said something to you and you didn't listen, like, how can we communicate better? Right. Instead, we like wait for those big life moments. Like, which is it? Like, maybe is it both? Do we just let things boil up, or are we just not taking the opportunities when they show, like as a practice?
Yes. Okay. I love this question because I actually think what it points to, Jordan, what you're asking is that we have a very faulty paradigm of what healthy relationships look like. And I think that is ultimately why. And what I mean by that is the paradigm that most of us exist under when it comes to relationships is that conflict is bad. Would you agree? Like most of us think, oh God, it was just clementines. Like I would be such a bitch if I like mentioned the clementines one more time.
Totally. Yeah. I think
right?
Avoid conflict at all cost.
Like at all costs, because we believe that conflict is bad. We don't believe that conflict is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for growth, for more intimacy, for more transparency, for us to get to know each other in a deeper way, right? For me to show you more of me and for you to show me more of you, right? For us to have a more authentic relationship. We don't have that paradigm of conflict. We have the paradigm that conflict is bad. Conflict is risky. Conflict creates problems.
Yeah, if there's conflict, I'm a problem. right?
I'm a problem,
Mm.
right? Like this is like, and we don't want this. It's just too uncomfortable. Right. But what if we could learn to sit in the discomfort of what emerges when there's conflict? It is uncomfortable. Like there is some discomfort, right? And saying to your partner, but listen, like I asked you for clementines and, you got big oranges instead. And like, what happened here?
Do you even know me? I'm just kidding.
Do you even know me and my fruit eating habits? Right. But what happened here? Right. And we don't want to have those small conversations because we don't want to create conflict or tension on a Tuesday evening. Right. When we'd rather just sit on the couch and veg out or whatever it is. And so we don't practice the skill.
So then when those big moments show up, we're kind of poorly equipped, but also like the way it lands with that other person, right? Who now we've like conflict avoided with forever. And then we like blow a gasket and like, that's not fair. That's not really fair to them either, right? Because we haven't exactly given them opportunity to see that boundary that we're trying to set or see that communication.
It's actually not fair at all. It's what I call, like the opposite of the emotionally intelligent woman is the emotionally reactive girl, right? I often use that analogy. And when we choose to keep our disappointments, our letdowns, our grievances, whatever it is, to ourselves, we're choosing it. The other person's not saying to us, listen, don't tell me about the clementines one more time. We're choosing not to say anything. When we choose to do that, and we choose to bottle it up, we're also responsible then for, flipping our lid. Right.
Which is a tough thing to hear a little bit, right? Because I think, we can sometimes tell ourselves that story like that the reason I'm not telling them about the clementines is that they blah, 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 right? I don't think we're always taking that. I like that radical responsibility term, and I'm pretty sure I throw it into every single podcast episode, but we're not taking like radical responsibility for the way that conversation is going. I remember one of my favorite conversations with my psychologist. He was like, Jordan, you are 50% of all of the conversations that you're in or not in, right? And I was like, how dare you, right? Blame me for 50%. But truly,
yes.
You are, right? If there's two of you in the conversation.
That's
conversation that's not being had, you are still 50%
yes.
of that.
Yes. And I just want to go back to some like what you just said there, because this is exactly what I mean when I say fearless communication, right? So we choose not to say anything. I love that we're sticking with clementines. Like we choose not to say anything about the clementines because we don't want to deal with the outcome. Right. So for me, learning to communicate assertively and learning to communicate from a place of emotional intelligence means that I choose to have difficult conversations regardless of the outcome. Like the outcome is not what's going to cause me to decide. Like that's not the determining factor for me as to whether or not I have the difficult conversation.
I feel like that's scary.
It is. And I call it someone actually, it's funny. I was interviewed on a podcast recently and the person interviewing me was a communication expert. So it was a little intimidating, but she asked me about this term fearless communication. She kind of challenged me on it. And I said, well, listen, here's what I mean by fearless communication. It's not that fear is not present. It is scary. It's uncomfortable. It's anxiety provoking. I still get nervous when I have to have difficult conversations. It's just that fear doesn't dictate what I do. Like fear is not making the decisions. Fear is no longer in the driver's seat of how I show up. Because for so much of my life, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I bet you there are some audience members that could. For so much of my life, I made decisions based on fear. They were all fear-based decisions. If I showed up in a room, how loudly I spoke, if I put my hand up, if I kept quiet, if I had a voice, if I didn't have a voice, if I told you, excuse me, I was in line first, right? Whatever it was, like it was always fear. And almost always fear told me to just shut up and be quiet.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about this. Where I go with it. So I'll give you where I go with it is what happens if the outcome does suck, right? And I think that's, I think that's where we as women, that's where we we sit, right? And it's like, well, I do
Yes.
want to show up fearlessly, but what if they do leave?
Yes.
Right? Like, what
I
if
love
they
this
do?
question.
Because
Yeah.
I think there's some grief also that comes from fearless communication. I'm thinking about myself specifically, right? I've definitely had some, friend divorces that came from me having a fearless approach to talking about my needs, and that person deciding to never talk to me again, or it was actually multiple people deciding that, like, okay, I guess we're no longer friends because you have clearly stated that you need something from me and I can't provide that. And so the outcome was really shitty. And I do think, like, I can look back and go, I approached that with integrity. I tried to have a very calm, great conversation. I clearly stated my needs and my boundaries, and they left.
Mm-hmm. Hold on. Can I challenge you on that?
Totally.
Was the outcome really shitty?
Well, no, but the immediate outcome involved grief. Right?
Yes.
Because
The feeling.
yeah, the
right.
feeling.
You had a feeling that was really uncomfortable in that moment.
That's right. Yes, but you're right. The long game outcome was that those relationships weren't serving me either. I just had to, like, finally admit it, or come to that, that moment, so that they could change course. And so you're right, thank you for that, because you're right, the outcome actually is good. It's that, like, immediate grief of, like, oh, this is not what I thought it was, or they're not who I thought they were, or turns out they don't like me for who I am, or me being authentic did drive someone away. That like initial was so shitty,
Yes.
on all of those occasions, that I think that's what holds you back. And then that starts to make you question, like, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea to be that authentic.
That's right. And that's exactly what makes, so what you're describing is the cycle that happens, or the interplay that happens between our emotional mastery skills and our communication skills. Because everything you described, Jordan, were thoughts that you had in your head.
Totally.
And thoughts are not facts.
Totally.
Thoughts are just
Yep.
thoughts. They're just thoughts. They're just thoughts.
Yes.
Right? We can hold them loosely, right? But this is what gets in the way, is what we say to ourselves can make it difficult for us to have those conversations. And so what you're describing is that period of time right after you had the conversation. That's the period of time where we're the most emotionally activated. And what we need during that period of time are a set of skills that allow us to emotionally regulate rather than become even more activated.
I haven't read that chapter yet.
You haven't read that chapter yet? The first section in the book is all around, like, emotional mastery skills. It's these skills. Mm-hmm. And so what you were describing just now in terms of what was going on in your head is what I would consider either catastrophizing or fortune telling. This is what's going to happen every single time I set a boundary. See, I knew I was right. If I just, show up as my authentic self, then nobody's going to like Jordan, because everyone's just going to think Jordan's such a bitch. Right?
Yeah, that's bang on. And I will say, like, so for me personally, and I like that we're using me as an example, I think this is fun. That those automatic thoughts for me haven't changed my future approach. So this is multiple. I'm talking about multiple instances here where the boundary setting, the ask, right? This is what I need, has resulted in termination of friendships multiple times. But when I think about, like, those automatic thoughts that happen afterwards, I can see why that would derail the future showing up. I'm definitely, like, I would rather, like, I'm going to love hard and then lose hard in all of those kind of relationships, but I still try. I'm still going to love hard the next time anyways. But when I think about, trying to translate some of these skills into the partnerships or whatnot that women are having, that immediate, like, period of time after the conversation, setting the boundary and whatnot is so vulnerable in those moments to not staying the course.
It's critical. It's critical. And I want to just circle back really quickly to where we started, which was the framework. So for me, I actually, and I do this, like, really because I think I have an ethical responsibility to this. I don't teach assertive communication or boundary setting until I teach emotional mastery. Because unless we have the skills to self-regulate, I really believe that we're just like randomly saying no, randomly setting bound. Like we don't have the skills to then like manage our own stuff once shit hits the fan. Because I can't promise that shit won't hit the fan when you start having these honest conversations. There's ways to mitigate the risk, of course, right? And we want to be smart about it and intentional about it. We want to choose carefully how and when and right what we're sharing, all of those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, I think the most important skill, Jordan, for us to have around emotional intelligence is the ability to self-regulate, to regulate our emotions, because we can't control how another person's going to react.
Yeah, I love that. You're right. Because it's basically like you're setting them in, like sending them into the wild, like to basically, I don't want to say like to battle, but kind of like without like the actual like training behind it to be able to be like, how are you going to manage this when, because you are still only 50% of the conversation, right?
That's right. That's right.
In those scenarios, for me, it turned into like, I showed up like with 100% integrity. I feel really good about the way that I showed up. They also had to show up, right? In order for that to be the outcome, I'm saying in air quotes, that maybe I wanted. It makes me think like just how important these skills are so that women can develop circles of other women who have these skills.
I'm glad you said that. It's so interesting to me that the more I've practiced these skills in my own life, like my circle of friends has gotten so much smaller, right? Like so much smaller and tighter and, all of those sorts of things. And the truth is, the more we practice these skills and the more we show up from a place of emotional intelligence, you will find that you will naturally, and I don't mean outgrow in terms of like a hierarchical outgrowing, but just going separate ways from certain people in your life. And you will also attract other people into your life, right? That I call them boundary lovers, like that really love boundaries and can see that, oh my God, boundaries actually make our friendship really safe. Right. And really like predictable. And like, I know how you're going to show up. It's just like you said at the top of our conversation, we can not talk for 6 or 8 months and nothing terrible has happened. And we can just pick up.
And I want that for people, right? I want that, like, I want that experience of like connection and friendship. And because I do think the like return, I'm going to call it a return on investment just to like make it a business, I'm going to circle back to the business side of things, but like that, like the return on that is so rich for women, like in every aspect of their life, actually, if they're able to hold space for those kind of conversations and then for each other. Like when you think about, and I think this probably relates to your purpose, when you think about what the potential is of the emotionally intelligent woman, like what does her life look like? Like, what does she do?
Yeah, right. I love it. I love that question. I want to scale back for 1 second. I just remind your audience, like I started out as a psychotherapist and I started mental health. Okay. Almost 20 years ago. And when I started out practicing in mental health, I worked in nonprofit. I saw a lot of, co-occurring like trauma, addictions, childhood sexual abuse, like women abuse cases. Like I dealt with a very, very, very difficult, very heavy caseload. And I remember when I was working in the trenches is sort of how I remember that time in my life. And I'm grateful for the years that I spent serving in nonprofit and in marginalized communities and all of those sorts of things. But so much of the work that I was doing was helping people just survive, right? Like just survive, like just set enough boundaries that you weren't going to get hurt, right? Physically or sexually or mentally or, verbally, whatever it was like survival. And so I'm a very, very firm believer that if you are tapping into your purpose, you will evolve as a human and your work will evolve, your mission will evolve, and you'll have different iterations of what you do in the world, but they're all connected. So when I think about how I evolved, right, and I think about how my work evolved, Jordan, what happened for me is I think I went from, oh my God, I want women to do so much more than just survive. Like, I really want women to do so much more than just survive. And I remember so well, there was a point early on in my career where I worked at they called it a walk-in clinic for therapy. Believe it or not, there like such a thing existed in the nonprofit world. It was walk-in. Something had just happened. You could come in that morning, fill out an intake form, and there were clinicians on site, and we would see you as if it was like a walk-in medical clinic. And I remember during that particular day of practice, the amount of women I would see that were coming with bruises on their face. And literally, my work was survival. Like, how do I help you survive when you go home? Right. And so I think for me, when I think about the evolution of my work and the evolution of the framework even that I use, it's that movement from survival to really thriving and to showing up fully and unapologetically in our lives. So to bring it back to your question, ROI, like the ROI on emotional intelligence for me is really about helping women like live as fully and as boldly and as vibrantly and as unapologetically as possible. And that became so important to me because I saw the flip side of that, right? I saw what it looked like when that wasn't happening to any degree. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And it's so amazing, right? That like, yeah, it's amazing. And I think it's hard to separate out these skills with when we think about like health in general, right? Because so often when we're working with women, there are barriers to taking their lunch to work or going to the gym or getting an hour of sleep extra or whatever it is actually stems from their like challenges with upholding all of those other boundaries, right?
Yes.
So like the same woman who won't ask for a raise is the same woman who won't ask her partner for a nap. Can you please hold the baby?
Yes,
So
that's exactly it.
if we can help her, and so I would come up to the ROI thing, because I think women can be like, yes, of course I want to make more money, but no, I am not going to ask my partner if I can have a nap.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you and I both know that like it goes hand in hand, right? Like I really believe how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Mhm.
How you show up in one context is how you show up in the other, right? And if you want that raise, if you want a bigger mission, if you have a bigger vision for your life, whatever it is, right? I really, really believe that the key to that is navigating all of your relationships, including the ones at home. And sometimes, especially the ones at home.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, because then I think I just had a flashback to our previous podcast that we did together that was on like, the way that your family of origin starts to set some of the stage. I couldn't pick that out at the beginning when we started. I'm like, oh, that's what we talked about last time actually, was where
That is
some of those like automatic thoughts and processes come from. And often it's this learned behavior that comes from who we were exposed to during those formative years. But we carry out a lot of that at home the most,
Mhm.
right? Where when you get a new job, it's like you get a new opportunity to try and show up as someone different, or practice some of the skills you picked up at your last job. But when people are in long-term partnerships, it's like they're still working their first job essentially, unless they like go
That's
out
right.
of their way to do a little bit more training.
Hmm. Hmm. And really shift how they're showing up in that. I call it, like when I think about like the relationship management piece of the work that I do, there's boundary setting is one aspect of it. It's a big aspect of it, but it's renegotiating our relationships. And I really believe as adults, I think you and I are both in our 40s
Yes, I
now. Am
just
I
turned 40.
right? Yes. Yes. Okay. I thought so. Um, Right. And I think, particularly for a lot of women that I work with that are in their 40s, we're at a stage in our life where we really need to renegotiate our relationships, right? The relationships that we have, most of the relationships that we have today are perhaps relationships that we've been in for the last couple of decades, maybe, right? somewhere in and around there. And who we are today and what our needs are today are not the same as what they were in our 20s. And so if those relationships have not been reassessed, renegotiated, reboundaried, then we're still existing in this like old paradigm, right? So how are we going to show up fully in our 40s if our relationships are still reflective of where we were at in our 20s?
It's funny when you opened with talking about all the different areas where emotional intelligence has gained steam, right? And from a research perspective, right? We're saying, okay, we're seeing it in leadership style conversations in the workplace. We're seeing it in schools, right? I think even as parents of those pre-teenish kids, right? We want them to practice assertiveness. I took my daughter to get her nails done after she got her COVID vaccine, and watching her assertively ask for a very particular color coordination on her nails, I was like, yes, I'm doing good. I'll barely tell them to stop if they're like cutting the side of my finger, right? And she so we want that for our kids, and we're actually encouraging it. And yet we're in a weird window that unless you've gone out of your way, we haven't naturally been exposed to any of these things, right? Unless you're like very much in the entrepreneurial leadership space and you've invested in yourself. I got really fortunate that my undergraduate degree was like this futuristic conversation about learners and communication. And I was given all of these skills at, 22, which I'm super grateful for. But that was like this weirdo undergraduate program that I did that at the time was not the norm. So women that are like in their between 30 and 50 right now have not been given these skills like just by chance, right? They have to go out of their way to get it.
You're so right. I love it. Yeah, like that's exactly it. It's like, I think the reason I'm so passionate about this whole topic is these are skills that I believe we all deserved to have, and we were taught the exact opposite. And if I were to be, if I were to really think back, like when did I get really interested in this? It was probably, my daughter's 12 now. It was in her first year of motherhood, my first year of motherhood, right? So when she was about a year old, I started to do a lot of speaking within the school board. And it was all around emotional intelligence. And it was parenting workshops and workshops for educators and administrators all around how do we build resilience, build confidence, and reduce anxiety, because mental health was on the rise about 12 years ago, especially in children. And at this time, it's when the school board recognized it was a real problem that was getting in the way of access to education. And it was at this time that they started to have funding specifically for this sort of a resource. So schools would reach out to me and pay me for these workshops. And I remember thinking about it and going, we didn't have this when I was growing up. And that for me was the marker of the gap, right? That existed. It's like, wow, when I was a kid, or when, my parents were raising me, this was a non-issue. There was no training on it. There was no attention given to it. There was no research. There was no, right? Like this wasn't important. And so you're absolutely right. I think as parents raising children today, we're so acutely aware. And I think we all desire to equip our children with these skills. And we need to pause and recognize and ask ourselves, but do I have these skills? Do I have the skills to actually lead by example and to model this for my kids? Right. And, you're reading the book like that was actually my turning point, Jordan, right? Was recognizing, no, I don't I don't actually have these skills. And if I don't do something about it, I am simply going to model the exact opposite of what I desire my daughter to have.
Yeah, because and even we can see on the conversations on social media, right? It's like, if my kid doesn't want to give you a hug, then we're not going to give you a hug, right? Like, and yet, I think we don't always, use the example or joke about the nail salon, right? Sometimes they'll cut the side of my finger and I'm like, it's fine. And so, I want women to know that this is not it's not their fault that they haven't had that exposure, right? And Now we've created
Yes.
infrastructure for other groups of people to be exposed to these things at various stages of their life where it really matters. And yet we have this whole pocket of women who are going to have to go out of their own, like going to have to go out of their way to get it. Yeah, you're going to have to
You're gonna
like
have to work for it.
buy a
Yep.
book and go out of your way, right? And people always ask me like, why I do therapy like every single month for 10 years, whether I've needed it or not. I'm like, because this takes a lot of work to get to where you want to go. It's not going to just naturally happen by accident. One of the things, Shyamala, I wanted to kind of leave our listeners with is, we talked about that, emotional mastery. And I love the terms that you put to everything. I think it makes things really accessible. I think when we think that we've mastered something, we know what that means. But is there a good first step that listeners can take? They're now hearing, okay, this is important. I can recognize there's some gaps. Maybe I am reactive. Maybe I am catastrophizing. But how do we take that initial step? Is it about reflection? Is it about like, what is it about to take that first step forward to master your emotions?
I love it. And the place to start is emotional mastery, mastering your emotions. Please don't start with the other stuff. I really do feel like I do people a disservice if they sort of just jump in with some of the other pieces. But there's two things I'll say about that. One, and it really depends on kind of who you are, who's in your life, those sorts of things. So one way you can begin the journey of emotional mastery, because let me tell you, it's a journey. I still friggin' work on this every single day, like every single day. I could tell you a story every day about a time where I'm like going to lose my shit. And I'm like, emotional mastery, take a deep breath. Like, where are the skills? Right. So the first step really, I think in that journey is awareness of your reactive tendencies. There's lots of different first steps you could take, but it's kind of a bit of a good one to take, because we can feel our emotional reactivity pretty easily. Like it shows up physically, right? Heart rate goes up. For some people, they get shaky. For some people, they get hot. For some people, they get cold. But there's usually a physical response, a physical bodily response when we are highly emotionally reactive. So it's sort of an easier place to start. If your emotional language, your emotional intelligence, your emotional awareness, if it's not very high to begin with, that's an easy place to start. Is just notice in your body when you feel reactive. Okay. Your body is such a great cue for that. And then simply try and name what is it that's causing that reaction? For most of us, I'll give you a little clue. It's probably a fear or a worry about something that we can't control. Okay. So that's a good first step. Another first step, if you're still like, oh, Shyamala, but like, I don't know, I'm really not very emotionally aware. I'm not even really aware of my body. I don't even know if I would notice. I'm so good at suppressing, right? Like I've got all these numbing strategies. I don't know. Then if you have someone in your life that you trust, you could ask them for feedback. This is a really powerful one. And then you've got to be willing to take it. But you could ask, could be a sister, could be a friend, could be a partner, could whoever. But it's to ask them, listen, I'm really curious, what do you notice that I do or don't do when I get really stressed? Like that's a good word to use for emotional reactivity. Like when I'm stressed, what do you notice? If I were to ask like my daughter that or my partner that, they would have a whole list of things that they would tell me, like, this is what, because they can see it, they can feel it. It's like palpable in the room often. And so, I spent most of my life actually really like being defensive of feedback. But if you're open to receiving that feedback, that's another way to start that journey of emotional mastery, is asking other people what they see and how they experience you.
I love both of those examples. I like the word notice, and I will say I use the word notice a lot in clinical practice when we've given someone something to do and they come back and we say, well, what did you notice? And it's funny because often women will be like, what do you mean? What did I notice? But it's actually a very it doesn't direct the conversation, right? It doesn't say like, well, what's it like for you when I'm freaking out, right? It's like,
Yes.
when these situations come up, what are you noticing about me? It's a very like, it's like almost like a peaceful way to ask that question and elicit the kind of information
Right.
that you're looking for, actually. And we use that question
Mhm.
a lot. And it's interesting. I was going to use another personal example. I seem to be full of them today. That I've asked my partner to talk about like what it's like when I have PMS. And one of the
Mhm.
strategies that I have used and that I'll encourage patients to use is like, we shouldn't talk about the crying baby when there's a crying baby in the room, right? Like that's the
Yes.
worst
I love
time to
that.
like try and tell your mother-in-law to like back off around, the feeding
Yes.
strategy or whatever. But the same is for for
Correct.
conversations, especially around hormonal health and mental health for partnerships, is not to be like, when you're in that like rage space, to be like, what do you notice about my mood? Because I'm going to like kill you with these lasers coming from my eyes, no matter what you say. But involving and communicating really clearly with that partner around what it's even like for you, right? I think also goes
Mhm.
quite a long way. My personal story is, on the weekend, I lost this brand new sweatshirt that I had bought. And I had like a total like PMS moment about it, where I was mad and I was in my room and I was like, my fists were like, and I was pretty sure that someone had stolen it. I was pretty sure that my husband had like put it through the wash when I really didn't want it to go through the wash. And I was like rage searching for it all around the house. And he was just sitting there in the chair. And in the moment, I was like, okay, this is one of those times where I'm losing my shit. And I actually don't need him to help me look, but I'm really mad that he's not helping me look.
Right.
And then I found it and
Right.
it was all over. And I was like, I'm sorry, like that you had to like witness or experience that. And he was like, that's okay. This is what it is, Jordan. This is what happens.
Mhm.
And it was such a way more productive conversation than in the past, where I would have said, like, get off your ass and help me look for this sweatshirt. You put it
Right.
somewhere, right? Like I literally would have accused him for putting it
Mhm.
somewhere.
Mhm. Yep.
It's your
Yep.
fault that I can't find this. Everything in our house is a disaster. You put everything away and I can't find anything, right? That's what it would have looked like in the past. And yet we both just like
Yes.
went about our merry way while I rage searched for it. And he just like sat drinking a cup of coffee,
Yep.
waiting for it to all be over.
Right. Because he self regulated. Right. He was able to self regulate in the midst of your like, "Boop,
Mhm.
I'm up here on the
Because we've
emotional
talked
scale."
about it,
Right.
right? And he was like,
Yes.
yeah, this is one of
Mhm.
those times where if you can't find something, you're gonna like blow it. And he's
Yep.
like, but you'll find it. Then if you don't, you don't.
Mhm. Right.
But
But
it'll
you'll
be
survive.
fine.
You'll
We
be
don't have to
okay.
have a
I'll
massive
be
argument about
okay.
it.
Yes.
Um, and
Yeah.
it reminded me of like how far we've come, because that conversation would have gone very differently in the past, where I would have like raked him into the conversation. And then he would have like,
Yes.
stood up for himself in a very aggressive way. Right. It was just a very different, like very peaceful rage looking for my.
Yes. I totally understand. So like so well, right? Like this is and this for me is it's actually such a beautiful example of emotional intelligence, because it doesn't mean that you don't lose your shit every
Mhm.
now and again. You do. But you're very like you were probably very aware of what you were doing in that moment. You're like,
Yeah.
I'm
I'm extra
raging.
mad about this because I have
This is
PMS.
right.
Right.
Yes, right? Yeah. Uh-huh. And you made an intentional choice to not pull him into your rage,
Mhm.
right? You're like, let him have his coffee. He's doing the right thing. He's making a good choice over there. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing over here, and it'll
Mhm.
be fine.
Yep. And I found it.
Mhm.
Like I found it. It was on my Peloton
Yeah.
and I had left it there. And so nobody had hit it on me. No one had stolen it and he did not put it away. Right. Um,
Right.
but that's a very different conversation, or it went down very differently than it would have like in years past, where it would have, and then we would have like, then it would have ruined our whole fucking weekend. Right.
Yes, I get it. I listen, I have been there, Jordan. Hence the book. Hence why I wrote the book. Like I've been there, right? Like I totally get that.
But these tools, and even just these like small examples that you've given our listeners today, I think it's like, it's normalizing that like it's not your fault that you don't have these skills, right? And it's showing you from like our perspective, we're still working on these things all the time,
It's
ongoing.
ongoing. It's literally when I say every day, I'm like every damn
Mhm.
day.
So much that it's
Really and
exhausting,
truly.
but we still keep doing
Mhm.
it.
Because what's the alternative?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, what's the alternative here?
Yeah, I don't really want that life, right? And even when I
Mhm.
gave those examples of like the grief and, I'm going to loosely call it like traumatic experiences of having people leave my life,
Mhm.
I still wouldn't choose the opposite, right? Which would have been to shrink and stay small and not be authentic and not show up, right? I would much rather this, even though it was the harder path initially.
Yes. Yes. That's right. Exactly. And I think, and I like that. I like us, like, I like this place where we're kind of landing with it. Cause, I think you'd asked me, like, who is the emotionally intelligent woman? I think she does choose the path less traveled, for sure. Sometimes the harder path. Her choices, often require courage, integrity, like all of those sorts of pieces. But I think it's because she's come to a place where she recognizes, like, it's like this fork in the road, right? Like, I can keep doing what I'm doing and shrinking and people pleasing and then like suppressing and then, flipping my lid. And I can keep doing all that emotionally reactive little girl stuff, but it's killing me. Like, it's destroying me. It's right. Like, it's not what I want. Like, I don't want to keep doing that. And so I'm going to choose this other path of the emotionally intelligent woman. And yes, it's going to require me to really like step up to the plate. It's going to require more courage. It's going to require more integrity. It's going to require me to actually practice these skills as if they were drills and I'm practicing for the big game. But this is how I want to live, right? Like, I want to live my life like fully and embodied and unapologetically. And I just don't want to shrink anymore.
And I love that word because we can visualize what that woman is experiencing when she shrinks in that scenario. We
Mm-hmm.
can probably all think of scenarios that we still shrink in, even if we're kind of on that journey of working towards being the emotionally intelligent woman. Thank you so much, Shyamala. I love your work. I appreciate you so much. I think you see people and see the potential in women, and that your passion for wanting to like put that like pen to paper to help more people than you could in your one-on-one practice, I find is so admirable. And I have a lot of gratitude for that kind of work because I think it really has this potential to shift the conversation for women and women's health.
Thank you. I love and respect and admire and appreciate you so, so much. Thank you.
How can we get a copy of your book now that we all realize that we need to read it twice?
So The Emotionally Intelligent Woman, it is published and available everywhere. Books are sold online on February 7th. I think at the time that this is released is somewhere in and around there, this podcast episode, I can't remember. But it should be available by the time this is released. And we're also having I am throwing a launch party and a masterclass. I'm teaching a free masterclass all on the emotionally intelligent woman. Who is she? How does she live, love, and lead with unwavering confidence? That happens on February 9th. And if you can't attend live, please do register. We're going to send out a replay.
Awesome. Yeah, this episode airs on February 3rd. And so we will put all the links to all of those things inside the show notes for the podcast so that you can get access to everything that Shyamala is offering, but also get yourself a copy of that book when it gets published. Thanks so much, friend.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.